It has been said, and maybe you have heard this before, that a preacher's task is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. Now, have you heard that before? Maybe not. Is that new to you? Well, let me say it again, because maybe you need to remember it. It's been said that a preacher's job is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. Here's what that means. It means that the preaching ministry that one has ought to communicate God's grace and compassion for those who are grieving, those who are sorrowful, those who have suffered loss. Good preaching ought to do that. On the other hand, preaching ought to challenge those who are spiritually indifferent. In the Old Testament, they're sometimes referred to as having stiff necks. They have rebellious spirits. They don't practice the faith. Maybe they are Christians who talk a good game, but who don't live the faith out as it ought to be lived. The bottom line is that good preaching is to master the art of saying that God loves you and cares for you, while at the same time saying that the scriptures say that we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and we can do better. We need to reform ourselves from our laziness, our indifference, and the list could go on. And so you try to draw a balance. Now, the reason I'm talking to you this morning about this combination of reassurance and rebuke, I'm talking about this because this seems to be precisely what the author of Hebrews is doing as we come to this particular point of the text. Now, you may remember that a couple of weeks ago, I think it was, we talked about the author of Hebrews' preoccupation with Melchizedek. You remember that? Melchizedek, whose name is mentioned in 2 verses in the Old Testament, 1 verse in the Psalms, and then in a whole lot of verses in the book of Hebrews. Melchizedek, very, very important. In fact, I probably suggested to you that it seemed to be a favorite understanding of this author, but I also said that probably in the larger scheme of things, your ability to understand the point that this person is making about Jesus being a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, in the larger scheme of things, it's probably not that critical. In fact, I think that you could probably live the rest of your life and not hear about Melchizedek again, and you would still be all right in your faith. Now, I don't think the author of Hebrews would agree with that statement. It concerns him that at this point in the text, it concerns him that his readers may have begun to glaze over. You know what it means to glaze over as a hearer? You're just kind of sitting there with your eyes open, but you're really not paying attention, and you're thinking, you just glaze over. And sometimes that happens listening to preaching and to other things, but I think it really concerns him. And so what he does in the narrative is that he calls a timeout, and frankly, he jumps pretty ugly with his audience. I mean, did you hear that a moment ago? You're looking at me like you might be confused. Surely you heard that first word where he says, I have a great deal more to say about this. He's talking about Melchizedek, by the way. He says, I want to say more about this, and I understand that it's a difficult subject. And why is it difficult? Well, it's especially difficult because they're too lazy to listen. They're too lazy to think. In fact, the sense of the original language is that they are dull people. Growing up in Texas, we used to call dull people dullards. I mean, I don't know if you use that term or not. Ray, did you ever use that term? You can now. You know, somebody's a dullard. That's a dull person. They're just kind of not there. You know, they're not too good at, thinking gives them a headache. Well, there's a pause in action from the comparison that he is making between angels, high priests, Melchizedek, and Jesus. A pause in the action. Now, I have to say this, that a helpful preaching technique, honestly, is to give people a mental break when you're preaching, especially if you're trying to explain something that's a little bit complicated. Now, let me tell you how I give a break sometimes. I'll say, everybody good? You with me so far? Gives you a little time to just sort of chill. Another thing that happens in good preaching, in the midst of some difficult concept, is you tell an interesting story or you offer an analogy. Well, in this case, the writer of Hebrews thinks that, well, it's a good time to pause and give my readers a break. In fact, it's a good time to give them a good chewing out. And so that's exactly what we have in the text. Now, how do you and I respond to a text like this? Well, he's not fussing at us. He was fussing at those people in the first century, but by the miracle of inspiration, some 2,000 years later, this text is a part of our New Testament canon, and the same Holy Spirit that inspired the text is the Holy Spirit that helps us to understand and make application of things that were written to people almost 2,000 years ago. And the truth is, we probably can find some application. An emotionally and spiritually mature response to a text like this is not just to laugh it off, as I have done to this point, but it's to ask ourselves if we might have some shortcomings and some characteristics in common with these Jewish Christians late in the first century who were tempted to fall away in their faith because of the onset or the threat of persecution. We have some things in common, and we need to heed the rebuke, and we need to seek to learn from it. So the preacher of Hebrews believes that only the spiritually mature can grasp the, what I would call, sublime significance of Jesus as a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And he says very plainly that he wants to say more about it, but these folks are just not in a position, or they don't have that posture of mind that's going to allow them to think and to be somehow spiritually enriched by what he is saying. They are a sluggish bunch. Now, if they were just slow to learn because of a lack of background knowledge, I mean, if you try to explain to me some concept related to chemistry, let's say, I mean, even something that's not that advanced in chemistry, I have a little bit of a background. It's been a long time since I was in the 11th grade, but it would be difficult. I mean, and let's say that your chemistry is your thing. It's what you do, you know. You'd have a hard time explaining to me certain things. Now, if the problem here was just a lack of background knowledge with respect to the subject, that would be one thing. But to say that they are too lazy to learn, that has a real sting to it. And it's some of the most frank language that we find in the New Testament. The other places are in Galatians, where Paul is so angry that he just sort of comes undone talking about these Galatians. But in our text, it's quite strong. It seems that these people are capable, but they're not willing to apply themselves to learning and to growing and to maturing in their faith. Their problem isn't limited exposure. It's not a low IQ. It's not the problem. The problem is with the people's spiritual immaturity. Maybe they've missed out on earlier opportunities to learn and to grow and to apply what they have been taught. It seems that they have failed to practice and reflect upon the scriptures, maybe to this point. Maybe this is why their faith, maybe this is another explanation for why their faith was faltering. But I want to suggest to you that their sin of dullness was what we might think of as a quiet, besetting, and destructive habit. You know, there are people who can, even people coming to church on a regular basis, can sit with their brain on autopilot and not take in the truth that they hear proclaimed in Bible study settings or in preaching like this. There are spiritual dullards in the church. You don't want to be a spiritual dullard. You don't want to be that way. You want to take in what is being taught and what is being proclaimed. In fact, I would encourage you, and I see some of you doing this, I would encourage you, when you come in here or when you get your bulletin, you see what the text is going to be. Read it and say a prayer, something like, Lord, I pray that this morning, through this text and what I hear about it, Lord, I pray you'll use it to strengthen my faith, to encourage me, to bring me comfort, to provide for me, O Lord, whatever it is that I need in my life at this moment. The text here is putting a lot of responsibility upon the individual learner for his or her own growth in spiritual maturity. I think that is a very important part of this text. And so you have a group of people that we can say who are on the milk plan for spiritual maturity. just yesterday, we FaceTime. Now, this is an example of a mental break I'm about to give you. Those of you who you're starting to heat up back here, I'm gonna give you a break now. You know, sometimes when you ask people to think and really, really think, it gives them a headache almost, because they're just used to sitting and watching television, you know, where you don't have to think too much. I've told Laura many times I think we have it's Hulu, where if you're watching a movie, they have commercials, you know, still a part of the thing. And I'm glad they have commercials, because sometimes if I watch those crime dramas and that kind of stuff, I sort of get lost. I need to have a thinking break. Well, I'm going to give you a little thinking break right here. We FaceTimed yesterday with our little granddaughter out in Colorado. And you've heard us talk about her, and she's going to be 6 months old in 10 days, and she's sitting there and she's smiling at us, and she's got a little round face, and it just occurred to me, hey, after 6 months, she's going to start eating regular food. You know, that's kind of a neat time where you get to see what your little one is going to really like. And as recently as when we were in Texas in January, we noticed that she often would sit in Laura's lap, and while Laura was eating, she would watch the food and she'd watch it go to her mouth, you know, and she seemed to be taking a keen interest in what was going on. Now, it would be tragic if she just stayed on milk from now on. She wouldn't grow and she wouldn't mature like she needs to. And so you got some people here on the milk plan in the text. The writer identifies 3 telltale signs of spiritual immaturity that I want to share with you in the time that remains. The first sign of spiritual immaturity that we see in the text is a casual, indifferent attitude towards Christian instruction. The truth is, folks, when we gather here on Sunday morning, yes, we are here to rejoice and to worship and to enjoy this and participate in this beautiful music that we hear. And we also are to be blessed by one another's presence and encouraged in seeing each other and getting caught up with one another. But the bottom line is we ought to be here to learn. We ought to be here to take in instruction. We ought to be here to be challenged in areas of our life. The failure to learn for these people didn't in any way suggest that they were just straight up stupid. No, that's not why they failed to learn. They failed to learn because they were too lazy to learn. Real learning takes application, practice, observation, and reflection. Now, I want to say that again. Real learning, now this is true in a lot of areas. It's also true in the Christian life. Real learning takes application, putting to work that which you have learned, applying it in your life. It takes practice, doing so over a period of time so that practice becomes something that you don't even have to think about it. It becomes second nature as a habit. Not all habits are bad. Some habits are good. It takes observation and reflection. Why do you think kids bring home homework? Why do they have things to do outside of the class? Because they need to put their hands to that which they are learning. Why do you think many professions smile upon internships for college-age students to expose them to the practice of that which they are earning a degree for, field education, what they call practicums, which is, a way of saying putting to work that which you are learning. Now, a second indicator of spiritual immaturity that he talks about in the text is one that you might think, well, that doesn't apply to me, but it might apply more than you realize. The second indicator of spiritual immaturity is the inability to teach. He says it very plainly here. He says, by now, some of you ought to be teaching, for goodness sakes, and I'm going to have to start over with the foundations for some of you. Now, I know, and you know, that everybody can't be a teacher. That is true both in practical life, in the secular culture, but it's also true when it comes to the formal New Testament office of being a teacher. Teaching is a spiritual gift. It is something that God blesses us with the ability to do, and it doesn't just apply to adults, it also applies to children. But how about those of us who are not involved in teaching or who feel as though we don't have a gift or a calling to teach? Well, Paul says in Colossians chapter 3, verse 16, you might want to jot that text down. Colossians 3:16, Paul says to those believers, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teach and admonish one another in all wisdom. We have the ability in the midst of our fellowship and in the midst of discussion and within the bonds of friendship to be able to reflect upon things in our own spiritual lives that are probably helpful to some other people. So, don't immediately just discount the notion of this inability to teach. Now, let me say a little more about this. As we move toward that third mark of spiritual immaturity, there's not a pastor anywhere who's been pastoring for a while who hasn't had somebody leave the church for some reason or another. But I would say that about 2/3 of the time, maybe 3/4 of the time, people will say, well, I'm just not being fed there anymore. Now that gets said a lot, and sometimes that might be true, but something I've noticed is that while that comment implies that the person saying it is an eager student of the Word whose maturity is at a point where they no longer can get anything out of the preacher's messages, those same people are people at least somewhat like those that the writer of Hebrews is describing. Instead of being so focused upon their own needs, by this point, they ought to be spiritually influencing other people in the church. In some cases, maybe they ought to be teaching. There was a young family in our church that decided to leave, and I don't know if I ever heard that they weren't fed, but they were dissatisfied. And I remember in my conversation reminding them that several years before I had asked their husband to step up and to begin teaching a men's class. He was ideal for such. He wasn't entirely new in the faith, but he was an eager learner, but somehow he didn't want to be saddled with that responsibility. Because if you have that responsibility, then you've got some studying that you need to do, and you need to be faithful and regular in attendance. You need to apply yourself. And my whole point in asking him to teach was yes, that it would provide for this men's class, but even more than that, it was going to help him grow up and mature and become a leader in the church who would have influence over others. And so sometimes with these people who are not being fed, sometimes, not always, you can look at their attendance, you can look at their track record for participation and opportunities for learning and ministry, and you can understand why they're dissatisfied and why they think they're not being fed. They're not applying themselves very well to that task. Now, the third mark of spiritual immaturity that we see here is really what I would say the opposite of what verse 14 describes. So quickly, look at verse 14 here, and I'm going to say that, let's read it. But solid food is for the mature, and notice what characterizes the mature. Now, the immature are those on the milk plan, but the spiritually mature, they're on the solid food plan. You know, meat, potato, no, I should say bulgogi, rice, other good Korean dishes, Some of that stuff gives you heartburn. Some of it does, but it's awfully good going down. It is. All right, for those, listen to this. But solid food is for the mature. What characterizes them? They're those whose senses have been trained to distinguish good from evil. The corollary of the passage is that immature Christians are out of shape and out of practice when it comes to living out the faith, and they also aren't very good at discerning on moral and ethical choices or decisions that have to be made. There are more people in our day and time whose values are tied more to political parties than they are to New Testament Christianity. And as I see it, it's a mark of immaturity. It's a lack of moral sensitivity and discernment, which ought to be our moral sensitivity and discernment ought to be based upon the Scriptures. That's where it ought to be based. A mature Christian conscience develops through enlightenment by the Scriptures, but also by practice in everyday life. One commentator made the point, and I thought was a very good one, in talking about Christian practice. He said, sometimes, I've already mentioned it, practice becomes a habit, and not all habits are bad. Some of these folks were in the habit of being on autopilot. They were in the habit of sort of checking out. Or maybe they were at that stage of life where they believed they had learned pretty much everything they were going to learn about faith, and so they just sort of checked out. And as they listened to preaching and teaching, they would think, oh, I'm glad he's on that subject today. I know at least 3 or 4 people here today that need to hear that message. They're like that. The point is that spiritual maturity is not a sudden experiential event. It is something that develops over time. It comes through steady application and spiritual discipline. I want to wrap it up by reading from something that I look at from time to time. Are you familiar with Eugene Peterson's paraphrase of the New Testament called what's it called? The Message. That's right, The Message, yeah. And it's a paraphrase. It's not a translation. And I'm sure that there are some parts of it that people don't like, but I find it more helpful than anything else. I want you to listen to the same text from The Message that I read earlier from this translation. We're going to wrap it up with this, but I love this. Okay, this would start at verse 11 of chapter 5. I have a lot more to say about this, but it is hard to get across to you since you have picked up this bad habit of not listening. By this time, you ought to be teachers yourselves, yet here I find you need someone to sit down with you and to go over the basics of God again, starting with square one, baby's milk. When you should have been on solid food a long time ago. Milk is for beginners, inexperienced in God's ways. Solid food is for the mature, who have some practice in telling right from wrong. There's the moral sensitivity and ethical sensitivity. And then we didn't spend time on these 3 verses in chapter 6, but just listen to them here. So come on, let's leave the preschool finger painting exercises on Christ. Did you ever do finger painting? It's probably still fun, but it was fun back then. Finger painting exercises on Christ and get on with the grand work of art. Grow up in Christ. The basic foundational truths are in place. Turning your back on salvation by self-help and turning in trust towards God, baptismal instructions, laying on of hands, resurrection of the dead, eternal judgment, God helping us, we will stay true to all of that, but there's so much more. Let's get on with it. That's a wonderful paraphrase, and maybe it's a lot easier to grasp than the way in which I have explained it this morning, but hopefully the Lord has spoken through our text. Let's bow our heads together for prayer.